In Egypt, scribes trained from childhood to copy hieroglyphic and hieratic script onto papyrus, working in close, dim chambers where the strain on the eyes accumulated year after year. No instrument existed to correct that strain. A scribe whose vision failed simply produced slower, sloppier work, or stopped working altogether. The profession had no answer for its own central liability. In Greece, philosophers turned their attention to the eye itself as an object of study rather than a tool to be repaired. Aristotle wrote about vision as a process of reception, the eye taking in forms from the world, but his interest was theoretical, not practical. Euclid examined the geometry of sight lines centuries before anyone considered bending those lines on purpose. Greek glassmakers, meanwhile, had already learned to shape clear glass into small curved pieces, polishing it for ornaments and for fire-starting tools that concentrated sunlight into heat. The raw material for magnification existed in their workshops. The application to failing eyesight did not. Rome inherited both the Greek glass trade and the Greek indifference to vision correction, but Roman writers left behind something the Greeks largely did not: direct, specific accounts of individuals coping with bad eyesight, using whatever objects came to hand. The most detailed source is Pliny the Elder, whose Natural History, completed in the 7th decade of the 1st century, catalogued minerals, animals, and human customs across the known world with an appetite for anecdote. Pliny recorded that the Emperor Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68, watched gladiatorial combats through a smaragdus, a green gemstone usually identified as emerald, or possibly a green-tinted glass imitation. Pliny did not explain Nero's reasoning. He simply noted the habit as one curiosity among many, listed alongside other strange uses of precious stones by wealthy Romans of the period. What was Nero actually doing with that stone, and why does it matter so much to a history of vision correction? The honest answer is that we do not know, and the uncertainty is not a minor footnote. If Nero held a curved, polished green stone up to his eye, and the games came into clearer focus, then he had stumbled onto rudimentary magnification more than 1,000 years before anyone formalized the principle into a lens ground for that purpose. If instead the stone was flat or only mildly convex, worn purely to soften the glare of a bright arena on weak or light-sensitive eyes, then Nero's smaragdus belongs to a history of sunglasses, not reading aids, and the connection to spectacles dissolves. Pliny's account gives no measurements, no description of the stone's curvature, and no indication of distance between the eye and the gem. We are left reconstructing intent from a single sentence written by a man who was not present at the games and who treated the detail as gossip rather than science. Later writers, eager for a dramatic point of origin, have sometimes stretched this fragment into a confident claim that Nero invented the corrective lens. The evidence supports no such certainty. It supports only a possibility, suspended for 2,000 years between magnification and mere tinting, with no surviving artifact to settle the question either way. Nero's own documented behavior, regardless of the stone's true function, reveals something about how a Roman emperor managed a personal limitation in public. Pliny's account is brief, but it is specific enough to function as biography rather than legend. Nero watched. Nero held the stone to his eye. Nero did this in the open, before a crowd, without apparent concealment. He did not delegate the viewing to an aide who could describe the action in his place, an option certainly available to an emperor surrounded by attendants. He did not retreat from the games on account of weak eyes. He adapted the moment, using an object already prized in his court for its rarity and color, and turned a private inconvenience into something almost ceremonial. Pliny's phrasing suggests no embarrassment attached to the practice. Whatever the smaragdus actually did to Nero's vision, the choice to use it openly marks a small but real decision, recorded by a contemporary chronicler who had no obvious motive to flatter or invent. The decision was Nero's alone, and Pliny's brief sentence remains the only surviving window onto it. Beyond the imperial court, ordinary Romans with failing close vision had access to a cruder but far better attested tool. Glass blowing had advanced enough by the early imperial period that clear glass spheres, sometimes filled with water, were produced for several purposes, including as decorative objects and as burning lenses for igniting fires from sunlight. Pliny himself described the use of glass globes filled with water to concentrate sunlight for cauterizing wounds, a medical application unrelated to reading. But the same physical principle, a curved, transparent surface bending light, also magnified whatever lay behind it. A person could lay such a globe over a page of text and watch the letters swell larger beneath the curved surface. There is no surviving Roman manual instructing readers to do this for the specific purpose of reading small script, and no Roman author wrote with the clarity that later medieval sources would bring to the practice. The closest the historical record comes is circumstantial. The objects existed, the optical principle was known well enough to be applied to fire starting and cautery, and the leap to using a glass globe as a literal reading aid required no new technology, only a different application of an old one. This absence of explicit instruction does not mean the practice never happened. It means Rome left behind tools without leaving behind the testimony to confirm how widely those tools were repurposed for failing eyes. Wealthy Roman households owned libraries, employed readers, and prized literacy as a mark of status, all of which created strong incentive for someone, somewhere, to discover that a water-filled globe made small letters legible again. Roman medicine, however, generally treated eye ailments as conditions to be cured through diet, poultices, or surgery, rather than conditions to be compensated for with an external device. Celsus, writing on medical procedures in the early 1st century, described surgical techniques for cataracts, but said nothing about external aids for the more common and less dramatic problem of age-related farsightedness. The gap in Roman writing between the existence of magnifying objects and any explicit statement of their use for reading remains one of the most persistent silences in the entire ancient record on this subject. Rome's libraries eventually passed into different hands. As monastic communities spread across Europe through the early medieval centuries, the work of preserving written knowledge fell to men who copied manuscripts by hand, in scriptoria lit by narrow windows and tallow candles, for hours that stretched across entire lifetimes. A monk who entered a monastery in his 20s might spend the next 5 decades bent over vellum, and the toll on his eyes was cumulative and predictable. Unlike a Roman senator who could simply stop reading once his sight dimmed, a monk's value to his community was bound directly to his ability to keep copying. Blindness, or even moderate farsightedness, threatened not just comfort but purpose. The Benedictine rule, which governed daily life in most Western monasteries by the 9th century, scheduled hours of reading and copying as non-negotiable obligations, and the physical demands of that schedule grew heavier as a monk aged. Scriptoria were typically unheated to protect the vellum and ink from damage, which meant scribes worked with stiff fingers in poor light for the bulk of the daylight hours. Illumination came from whatever windows the room allowed, supplemented by candles that monastic fire codes often restricted near flammable parchment. Under these conditions, the gradual blurring of near vision that affects most people by middle age became a direct threat to a monk's working life, and it arrived at the exact point in a scribe's career when his experience and steady hand were most valuable to the scriptorium. The solution that emerged was simple in construction and limited in distribution: a polished hemisphere of rock crystal or beryl, ground flat on one side and domed on the other, laid directly on top of the text. Light passing through the curved surface bent inward, enlarging the letters beneath it without requiring the reader to hold anything to the eye or wear anything on the face. These objects, later termed reading stones, required only a skilled lapidary and a source of clear quartz or beryl, both available in parts of Germany and the Alpine regions where such minerals occurred naturally. A monk could rest the stone on a single line of script, read the magnified word, and slide the stone forward, working through a page, one enlarged section at a time. The device demanded no mechanism, no frame, and no understanding of optical theory beyond the practical observation that curved, clear stone made small things look larger. How widespread was this practice, and how much of what survives represents the full picture rather than a handful of lucky exceptions? The honest answer sits uncomfortably between scarcity and certainty. Surviving reading stones are rare, scattered across museum collections in numbers that could plausibly represent either a niche tool used by a small fraction of literate monks, or a common solution whose physical remnants simply did not survive the centuries the way more durable objects did. Monastery inventories from the 11th and 12th centuries occasionally list crystal or glass reading aids among scriptorium possessions. But these references are brief, often a single line noting an object's existence without describing its use, its owner, or how often it left the shelf. A handful of stones, including specimens recovered from monastic sites in what is now Germany, show wear patterns consistent with repeated handling against parchment. But wear alone cannot confirm whether one monk used a stone daily for 40 years, or several monks shared it occasionally over a single decade. Without a written account in a monk's own hand describing his personal experience with failing sight and the stone that restored his ability to copy, the practice remains visible only in its physical residue, never in its lived texture. What can be said with more confidence is that the conditions producing demand for such a device were structural rather than incidental. Monasteries operated scriptoria as centralized, labor-intensive workshops where a single skilled copyist represented years of accumulated training that no community wanted to lose to something as ordinary as aging eyes. A reading stone, however limited in availability, addressed a problem that recurred in every scriptorium with every aging monk, generation after generation, across hundreds of religious houses spread from the British Isles to the edges of the Holy Roman Empire. The demand was constant and predictable even where the supply of the actual stones was not. Some scriptoria likely never possessed one. Others may have passed a single stone between several monks as their eyes weakened in turn. A shared tool rather than a personal possession, used in shifts by whichever scribe needed it most on a given day. Centuries before any monastery in Europe debated the limits of a single quartz dome. A scholar working in Cairo had already laid the theoretical groundwork that would eventually move the reading stone towards something far more deliberate. Ibn al-Haytham, known in Latin translation as al-Hazan, composed his Book of Optics in the early 11th century, and in it he rejected the prevailing theory that the eye projected rays outward to touch objects. He argued instead that light traveled from objects into the eye, a reversal that placed the eye in the position of a receiver rather than a searchlight. His work included detailed studies of refraction, the bending of light as it passed between substances of different densities, described with a precision no earlier writer had attempted. The treatise reached Latin-speaking Europe through translation efforts in the 12th and 13th centuries, carried along the same scholarly routes that brought Aristotle's full corpus back into circulation after centuries of partial transmission. Roger Bacon, an English friar working in the 13th century, absorbed this newly translated material and pushed it toward a conclusion none of his predecessors had stated outright. In his Opus Majus, completed around the year 1267 and addressed directly to Pope Clement IV, Bacon wrote that a segment of a glass or crystal sphere, when placed over letters, would make them appear larger and clearer. He went further than simple observation. Bacon stated plainly that such a device would help the old and those with weak eyes to see small letters at a sufficient size. The claim was not buried in a list of curiosities, the way Pliny's account of Nero had been. Bacon named the beneficiaries directly. He named the purpose directly. He wrote with the confidence of a man describing a solution, not speculating about one. The sentence marks the first clear, deliberate statement in the European record connecting a curved lens to the specific, named problem of aging eyesight, and Bacon's own treatise remains the source historians return to whenever they trace that connection to its origin. What Bacon described in theory, craftsmen in northern Italy began producing as an object within a few decades of his writing. By the 1290s, references to spectacles, framed lenses, worn in front of the eyes rather than laid upon the page, appear in scattered Italian records, sermons, and guild documents. The transition from a handheld reading stone to a wearable pair of lenses required someone to take Bacon's described principle, shrink the glass segment down, grind two matching pieces, and mount them in a frame that could rest across the bridge of the nose. That step, the actual invention of spectacles as a worn device, has no single confirmed author. Who first built that frame? And can the record actually settle the question? The honest answer is no, and the dispute has run for centuries without resolution. A funerary inscription in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Florence once credited a man named Salvino degli Armati with the invention, praising him as the creator of spectacles, but later scholars have found no corroborating record of an artisan by that name in any contemporary guild registry, and many now regard the inscription as a later fabrication, possibly composed generations after the fact, to claim civic credit for Florence. A separate and more credible account points to a Dominican friar named Alessandro della Spina, working in Pisa, who a chronicler described as a man who learned to make spectacles after seeing another, unnamed craftsman's device, and refusing to share the secret, and who supposedly began producing them himself once he understood the construction. Della Spina died in the year 1313, and the brief chronicle entry describing his work survives, but it credits him with reproducing an invention rather than originating one. The chronicle's own wording acknowledges an earlier, anonymous inventor whose identity it does not preserve. No surviving document names that first craftsman. No prototype from this period survives in any collection. 3 candidates exist in the record: an exposed fraud, a documented imitator, and an unnamed original creator who appears only as a reference inside someone else's biography, and the evidence cannot rank them with any confidence beyond that order. From those northern Italian workshops, the object began to travel. Venetian glassmakers, already famous for the clarity of their product through the guild-controlled furnaces of Murano, became early centers of lens production, and Venice's trading networks carried finished spectacles outward along the same routes that moved silk, spice, and glassware across the Mediterranean and into Central Europe. By the early 1300s, spectacles appear in inventories and paintings as far north as Germany and the Low Countries, mounted in frames of bone, leather, or metal that pinched the bridge of the nose or balanced awkwardly without temple arms, since the hinged frames resting on the ears would not appear for centuries yet. A wearer held the device in place with one hand or balanced it carefully while working, and the earliest depictions in religious paintings, including images of scholars and saints reading at desks, show exactly this one-handed grip, the frame pressed close to the face rather than secured by any mechanism. The lenses themselves split quickly into 2 distinct categories, though the underlying physics took time to articulate clearly. Convex lenses, thicker at the center than at the edges, magnified close objects and addressed the same age-related far-sightedness that had driven Roman emperors toward gemstones and monks toward quartz domes centuries earlier. These remained the dominant product for most of the 14th and 15th centuries, since the customer base, aging clergy, merchants and scholars, suffered overwhelmingly from this single, predictable condition. Concave lenses, thinner at the center, addressed the opposite problem. blurred distance vision, common in younger eyes, but concave grinding proved technically harder to perfect, and concave spectacles do not appear in reliable record until the 15th century, arriving roughly 150 years after their convex counterparts. The gap reflects a straightforward commercial reality. Lens makers refined whichever product their largest and most consistent customers demanded, and for most of the medieval and early modern period, that meant aging readers rather than nearsighted youth. Production methods themselves remained close to artisanal secrecy for generations. Guild structures in cities including Nuremberg formalized the spectacle-making trade by the 15th century, with apprenticeship rules controlling who could grind lenses and sell finished frames within city walls. Nuremberg, in particular, developed a reputation as a manufacturing center, producing spectacles in volumes large enough to be exported across German-speaking territories and beyond. The guild framework did more than protect trade secrets. It standardized quality to some degree, since a master craftsman's reputation depended on consistent grinding, and it created the first organized commercial infrastructure built specifically around correcting human eyesight, something neither Rome nor the monasteries had ever managed to formalize at any scale. How quickly did this growing commercial trade actually translate into corrected vision for ordinary people, rather than remaining a luxury confined to clergy, merchants, and the literate elite who could afford a finished frame? The record here pulls in two directions at once. Spectacles unquestionably became more available across the 15th and 16th centuries, with peddlers eventually carrying trays of ready-made lenses to markets and fairs, selling pairs ground to a handful of standard strengths rather than fitted individually to a single customer's eyes. This peddling trade suggests a genuine widening of access, since a market stall did not require the same wealth or connections as a personalized commission from a guild workshop. But literacy itself remained heavily concentrated among the same groups who had always had readiest access to spectacles: clergy, merchants, professionals, and the urban literate, which means the device's availability outran its usefulness for the broader population. A farmer who could not read gained little from a magnifying lens, regardless of price, and the great majority of Europeans, before the era of printed mass literacy, fell into exactly that category. Spectacles became commercially democratized well before they became functionally relevant to most lives, and untangling how many ordinary people actually wore them for practical reading, versus how many simply could not have used them productively even if they owned a pair, is not a question the surviving guild records or market accounts can answer with any precision. The arrival of the printing press in the latter half of the 15th century changed this equation permanently, though gradually rather than overnight. Movable type made books cheaper to produce and faster to multiply, and as printed materials spread into merchant households, professional offices, and eventually more modest homes across the following centuries, the population, with a genuine, daily reason to read, also expanded. Demand for spectacles grew alongside it, no longer confined mainly to clergy bent over manuscripts, but extending to a slowly widening class of readers encountering printed pamphlets, account books, and eventually newspapers. Lens grinding techniques improved in step, with opticians developing more reliable methods for testing and matching lens strength to an individual's eyes by the 17th and 18th centuries, narrowing the gap between a roughly graded market lens and a fitted correction designed around one person's actual vision. We're left, at the end of this long arc, with something that started as an emperor's curiosity and a monk's borrowed stone, and ended as an ordinary object sold at market stalls across an entire continent. The through line connecting Pliny's brief, uncertain sentence about Nero to a Nuremberg guild's standardized lens output is not a story of sudden invention, but of slow, repeated pressure, the same biological failure recurring in body after body, generation after generation, until enough independent efforts converged on a workable answer. What eyesight failure once took from a person, whether the capacity to govern, to copy scripture, to keep a merchant's ledger, or simply to recognize a face across a room, spectacles began, however unevenly and however slowly, to give back. The history of glasses, in the end, is really a history of who got to keep reading after their eyes gave out, and for how much of the population that privilege actually extended. If you've ever taken off a pair of glasses and felt the world blur instantly back out of focus, you've felt, for 1 second, what most of human history simply had to live with.